What's going on, guys? It's that time of the year again. Everybody's favorite discussion points. And as the titles of the video suggests, we are going to be discussing the upcoming Banlist announcement, which is going to be taking place on March 31st. And we got a couple of formats to discuss. Now, first and foremost, I know that there is going to be some hot takes in this video, so the most important part, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Let me know in the comment section down below. I'll do my best to try and read most of them. And this is an interesting one because I think there's a lot of differing opinions when it comes to standards specifically, and we have some things to touch on when it comes to that format. First of all, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. Let's start with Modern, because we have a bit of a breach problem on our hands. So the card Underworld Breach has been legal in Modern ever since its inception. It's banned in Pioneer, it's banned in Legacy. You can play it in Vintage, you can still play Underworld Breach decks in Vintage, but it seems that the card has sort of run its course in the Modern format, and it was really just a matter of time. Yes, the unbanning of Mox Opal did speed up that process by a decent amount, but even without the unbanning of Mox Opal, Underworld Breach is one of those cards that you have to very carefully design cards around. You can't really print too many playable 0-mana cards because they just work too well with Station and Breach. And if you look at the rest of the metagame, if you look at like all of the Mox Opal decks that people are playing, well, realistically right now, it's only Underworld Breach. There's not really a lot of other Opal decks. But I think of Affinity, Hammer Time, some sort of like Urza Asmo deck, Hardened Scales. There's a lot of cool space within the Mox Opal bracket. And I feel like once you remove Underworld Breach from the equation, it is entirely possible that one of those other Mox Opal decks becomes a little bit too powerful. Because, yes, I understand Mox Opal is a very powerful card, but I just kind of want to see what the format looks like without Breach and with Opal. And then if it is still a couple of months later, if it's still a problem, then we can address it there. It would also look very bad from a WotC standpoint to unban a card that brings a $170 price tag to then just immediately ban it. So I think there's basically 0% chance that they ban Mox Opal, and not going to say 100, but 99.999% chance that Underworld Breach gets banned. Now, there is some interesting discussions about, do they need to do anything else, right? Because if you think of kind of the big decks in the format, it's what? Underworld Breach, Eldrazi, Boros Energy, Orzhov Blink, and then some form of Murktide. Those are kind of like the 5 best decks right now. Now, I am of the opinion that you should just remove the most problematic card and then see how the format adapts from there, because if you remove Breach from the equation, you still have 4 other decks vying for spots. And I think a lot of people are really hesitant to play certain decks that just cannot compete with the speed of Breach because of how prevalent it is. So not only do you still have the other 4 big decks remaining, you could even maybe throw Storm in there if you wanted to. I think there's going to be a very large swath of other decks, specifically Mox Opal decks like Affinity, like Hardened Scales, like Hammer Time. I think a lot of those decks will then pick back up a little bit in popularity. I think that Eldrazi is extremely powerful, and there is the new Ugin that there's been a lot of chatter about. I'll do a separate spoiler video, so I'm not going to go too much into the new Ugin, but people are definitely talking about that card. But again, I'm of the opinion that if you ban Underworld Breach, see how the metagame shakes out from there. If, for some reason, a couple of months down the road, if Eldrazi is 30% of the metagame, or Boros is 30% of the metagame, maybe we can take further action from there. But I think right now, Modern is in an okay spot, sans Breach. There's a lot of cool decks, a lot of interesting gameplay. So get Breach out of here. It's a long time coming, and see how the rest of the format shakes up. So that is what I would do for Modern. Standard, on the other hand, this one's a bit tricky. So for those of you who did not check out Brian Kibler's video, I don't necessarily know if it was a prediction or if it was just his thoughts in general. I think it was more so like what he would do if he was in charge. And Brian Kibler made some very good, strong points about Monstrous Rage and Up the Beanstalk. And I'm going to maybe say a little bit of what he said, but kind of just try to formulate it in a different way, because I'm sort of the same opinion of him, where I think the format would be much better off if these two cards were removed. So let's start with Monstrous Rage. Now, the thing about the red decks in Standard right now is they are extremely linear. Now, you could say that this has been the case of red decks throughout the history of Magic, and I wouldn't necessarily 100% disagree with you. But if you compare red decks of today to, say, the Hazoret red decks, like that was probably peak red when it was Hazoret, Raminap Ruins, all that kind of stuff. Those decks were a lot more interactive. They played a higher land count, like 23 to 24 lands. They played a lot more burn spells, which could be used as removal spells, and a lot more, not necessarily pure card advantage, but sort of built-in card advantage, like Raminap Ruins and Goblin Chain Whirler and things like that. They were a lot more like mid-range decks, right? And if you're looking at the red decks today, they're 12 to 16 1-drops, 4 Burst Lightning, 4 Monstrous Rage, 4 Challenger, 4 Manifold Mouse, and that's pretty much it. That's the whole deck. It's all 1s and 2s and some Nemesis. A couple of points here about Monstrous Rage. So the first thing that I want to mention is it increases the speed of every red deck by basically 1 entire turn, and because of that, it leads to much shorter games on average, especially if your opponent does not have a removal spell. And that sort of kind of leans into the second point, where because Monstrous Rage is so powerful and speeds up the deck by an entire turn, you're basically forcing every other deck to play just a pile of spot removal, right? You have to play somewhere between like 7 to 9 cheap removal spells in order to compete with the red decks. And not a single one of those removal spells are really ever going to be online against the Zur Domain decks. So basically it kind of pushes you too far in one direction. And now once you've decided that, okay, well now I need to play 7 to 9 removal spells, I now have 9 bricks in my deck against the Zur deck, which is trying to play a long game and draw a bunch of extra cards, and I can't afford to have that many bricks. Another thing that Monstrous Rage does, and this might be a little bit more subtle, it basically just blocking is banned. That's the best way that I can put it. When your opponent attacks with 1 mana up and attacks with their 2/2 into your 3/3, it's like, what are you supposed to do? You can't realistically ever block. And under normal circumstances before, if it was just, say, a burn spell, right? If they have a 2/2 prowess creature attacking into your 3/3, and they use a burn spell to trade their 2/2 for your 3/3, that's a fine exchange, right? You're okay with that. If it was just burst lightning, you trade my whatever for your 3/3, you're totally fine with that. But it feels like with Monstrous Rage, you're just not ever allowed to block in those situations. Because when you do, you still take 3 to 4 damage and you've lost your creature for 1 mana. It's basically 1 mana Searing Blaze. And that's pretty brutal. It also discourages combat math. One of the interesting things about a lot of red decks in the history of Magic is there's a lot of like, do I double block, attacking and blocking? How much do I attack with? Do I need to race and all that stuff? And Monstrous Rage kind of just removes all of that from the equation. There's basically no situation where you're going to be on defense and you're going to have a profitable block. That's just not a real thing with Monstrous Rage. And then the last point here, it works probably a little too well with the Valiant Mice and the Double Striker Manifold Mouse. Basically, there's just 12 cards in your deck that, for all intents and purposes, just effectively draw a card or half of a card when you Monstrous Rage them. So I think for all of those reasons, and just the fact that the amount of pressure that it puts on the format, I personally think, again, bit of a hot take, I think that the format would be better off without Monstrous Rage. Now, that leads us to our next point, because if you want to remove Monstrous Rage, you can't just do that. You probably have to go a little bit more, because if you weaken the red decks and you don't weaken the Beanstalk decks, then we have a bit of a problem, because red is kind of what is keeping Beans in check right now. So let's talk about Up the Beanstalk, a card that, for what it's worth, is banned in Modern, legal and Standard. So Up the Beanstalk is an extremely messed up card. And I think the thing that it does the most that kind of infuriates me is it invalidates a lot of the cards that you would typically associate with being good against that style of deck. If you have a deck that has some ramp spells and some top end threats, usually discard Liliana of the Veil, all that kind of stuff. Usually, trying to trade with their specific resources is a good plan. Problem is, when they have Up the Beanstalk in play and you're trying to attack their resources, like their hand specifically, it just doesn't matter because they have a personal Howling Mine in play. Sometimes they're triggering it twice in a turn. So when you're upticking your Liliana and they're drawing 3 cards in their next turn cycle, it feels like you're not accomplishing anything. Your card just has no text. Now, granted, you can still get to the ultimate, but because they're cycling so much, they're eventually going to find a binding, and that's just not going to matter. Another weird thing about Up the Beanstalk, there's never a good way to trade with it. Again, typically, if you're trying to fight this deck on a sort of a resource advantage standpoint, a removal spell on Up the Beanstalk is a requirement, right? If you are trying to play more than 5 turns, you have to kill it on sight. Problem is, it's already replaced itself. There's no good window for you to trade with this card. Maybe if you're on the draw and you have a Spell Pierce, or if you're on the play and you have a Phantom Interference, if you can counter it on the stack, that's the only good way to trade with it. But basically, if it's in play, you have to kill it, and you're gonna feel bad about it. Especially if you're an aggro deck. The aggro decks can kind of ignore it to an extent, but if you have to take a full turn off to kill it, that also does not feel good. So here's another thing. I think we can probably all agree that it was not necessarily intended to work with cards that cost less than 5 mana, but for some reason, they keep printing them. I mean, obviously, Landline Binding was before Up the Beanstalk, but we had the Overlord cycle in Duskmourn, we had Ride's End in Aether Drift, and now we have, I can't remember the name, I'm going to have my editor put it up on screen, Rakshasa's Bargain, I think, which is 2/blue, 2/black. You'll see it on screen. And they just keep printing these cards that work with Up the Beanstalk. I just don't really understand when they're going to stop doing this. So, yeah, I mean, it feels like they realized their mistake, but they're kind of like double, triple, and quadrupling down on it. And I just don't understand what the point of that is. I wrote down here, it makes games not feel like Magic. And I guess I can elaborate because I don't really know why I wrote this down. It says, I wrote down, normally there's a battle of resources. You play removal early, then have your turn 4 or 5 be your big card advantage spell. But with Beans, you're accruing the card advantage up the curve while also developing and using your removal. And that kind of is true, right? When you play up turn 2 Up the Beanstalk, you're then playing a ramp spell on turn 3, drawing a card, a threat on turn 4, drawing a card, a sweeper on turn 5, drawing a card. Normally, you wouldn't be able to cantrip on all of those turns, and you'd have to take an entire full turn off, like turn 4 or turn 5, to cast your big Memory Deluge or what have you. But instead, the only turn you're taking off is turn 2, which probably fine, and then every other turn after that, you get the built-in card advantage without having to take an additional turn off. So that is, I guess, what I was sort of meaning by that. And then the last point that I have here, and I think the big reason why you kind of have to remove, like if you've chosen you want to remove Rage, you kind of have to do Beans as well. It pushes and pulls people in wildly different directions than Mono Red. And basically, going back to the Rage point, if you have a deck that loads up on 7 to 9 spot removal spells to compete with Monstrous Rage decks, you're then going to have 9 bricks in your deck against Beans. So I feel like, personally for me, I think the format would be a lot better off, and I think that there would be a lot more room for growth and room for exploration if you just removed the 2 complete polar opposite ends of the spectrum and just have more people fighting in the middle. I think that would be a very good idea. Here's the thing. If you remove Rage and Beanstalk from the equation, people are still going to play red decks. People are still going to play domain decks. They're still going to exist. They're just not going to be as polarized. And these, I think, are the 2 most polarizing cards. We've talked about Monstrous Rage. We've talked about Up the Beanstalk. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, what about the bounce decks? And that is a very good question, Watcher. Well, here's the thing. Now, personally, if you kind of think of Standard as a big 3, right? You have the bounce decks, the red decks, and the Beans decks. Well, if you hinder the red decks and you hinder the Bean decks, what about the town decks? Wouldn't those just be by far and away the best decks? You could certainly argue that. right? And that is a fear. But the thing that I noticed about these kind of like town, pixie, talent, nightmare decks over the past couple of months, they feel like they're going in a much less aggressive direction. They're becoming more of a mid-range deck. People are cutting Optimistic Scavenger. People are playing more copies of Stock Up. They're playing Overlord of the Balemerc. They're becoming a bigger deck. And I think at least the idea is to be a little bit better in the heads-up bounce matchups. In that scenario where they're becoming like less of a polarized aggro deck and more of a, they're basically, that's the whole point of this exercise, is to get more people to fight in the middle. They're already doing that. Now, it is possible that if they don't have to worry about Rage of the Beanstalk, maybe they go back to the more aggressive the aggressive end of the spectrum. But I also think that the town decks are a lot easier to attack, right? People have been playing more Obstinate Baloths, more Wiltleaf Lieges, more cards that are just generally good against like having your opponent discard them. Cards you can play in the graveyard like Abhorrent Oculus, Monument to Endurance is a good card against Nightmare. So there's enough counterplay to your opponent discarding a whole bunch of cards. And as long as they don't have the Scavenger, they're not really taking advantage of the 2 life that they're getting from the Hopeless Nightmare, since they're a lot less aggressive. So I think for now, I'm okay with the town decks, but I mean, this Town Ain't Big Enough, I think, is a card that is certainly on the watch list if these bounce decks become a little bit too powerful. The counterpoint that you could make for town is it does sort of, not going to say invalidate, but it makes playing 4 and 5 mana cards that don't have an impact on the battlefield basically impossible. But let's be honest, most of those cards we're not going to see play anyways, given how aggressive the red decks are and so on and so forth. So most of those cards probably would not see the light of day, even sans town. So I think that is kind of maybe a moot point. So I think for now, I'm of the opinion that Rage and Beans, you gotta go. If I was in charge, I would certainly remove them, and I would definitely put This Town Ain't Big Enough on the watch list. Now, in closing, and all the stuff that we talked about, as far as Banlist predictions, even though we had this lengthy conversation on Monstrous, Rage, and Up the Beanstalk, my prediction is nothing is going to happen. Now, I, again, just want to preface this, I think the format would be much better off without Rage and Beanstalk. But they did mention, I want to say, what, year-ish, maybe year and a half ago, that they would only be using a very small specific window during rotation to address bans, unless there was an emergency. So basically the question you have to ask yourself is this an emergency? Personally, I think it kind of is, but I don't know if they necessarily feel that way. So I would like to see Rage and Beans go, but unfortunately, I think we're probably going to be stuck with them for a little bit longer. But that is going to be it for today's video. Again, thank you all so much for watching. Please, I would love, love, love to hear all of your guys' thoughts in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you next time. Adios.